August 1944, Northern France. A German staff officer sits at a field desk, his hand trembling as he writes. Outside, an entire panzer division is burning. Flames devour 30 tanks in less than 20 minutes. Bodies of elite Wehrmacht soldiers scatter across the smoking road, torn apart by an enemy that appeared from nowhere. The officer's pen shakes. He writes one final line before American armor breaks through his command post. This general does not fight the way we were taught Americans fight. He fights the way we were taught to fight. That officer had just become the latest victim of a man whose name sent ice through the veins of Hitler's most decorated generals. A man who destroyed 1,300 German tanks, killed 47,500 enemy soldiers, and captured over 500,000 prisoners in just 281 days of combat. A man the Germans called the most dangerous American of the entire war. His name was George S. Patton, Jr. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next incredible stories. Join us as we uncover more history, more heroes, and more unforgettable moments from the past. Welcome to our community of history lovers. But what you're about to hear has been hidden for decades. Buried in classified German military archives. Whispered only between former Wehrmacht generals in post-war prison cells. The shocking truth about what Germany's finest military minds actually thought about Patton. Their secret reports, their private confessions, their terrified admissions that they had no answer to this American monster who moved armies the way other generals moved platoons. What these German commanders wrote will change everything you thought you knew about World War II. The year is 1942. The war is going horribly for the Allies. In North Africa, British forces are getting smashed by Rommel the Desert Fox. The Germans have perfected a terrifying new form of warfare called blitzkrieg, lightning war. Fast armor, fast infantry, fast victory. France fell in 6 weeks. Poland fell in 5. The mighty Soviet Union lost 3 million soldiers in the first 6 months alone. The American military, a joke by comparison. When the United States entered the war, its army ranked 19th in the world, smaller than Portugal's, smaller than Romania's. American soldiers had never faced a modern armored battle. They didn't know how. They didn't have the equipment. They didn't have the doctrine. Then came Kasserine Pass, February 1943. Tunisia, the first major American tank battle of World War II. It was a catastrophe. Rommel's panzers cut through American positions like a hot knife through butter. In just 10 days, the U.S. Second Corps suffered 6,000 casualties. 183 tanks destroyed. 208 artillery pieces lost. American soldiers fled in terror. German generals laughed. Reports reached Berlin describing the Americans as soft, inexperienced, incapable of modern warfare. Hitler himself dismissed American fighting ability as worthless. The Allied High Command was desperate. Something had to change. Someone had to transform these broken American units into a force that could actually fight the Germans. But who? Every traditional general had failed. Every textbook approach had collapsed against the Wehrmacht's speed and brutality. But everything was about to change because of one man nobody took seriously. A man the American establishment considered too crazy, too unpredictable, too dangerous to lead a major army. A man whose own superiors had nearly ended his career more than once. George Smith Patton, Jr. was born in 1885 in San Gabriel, California. The son of a wealthy family with deep military traditions, he grew up obsessed with warfare. But he was no ordinary soldier. Patton was eccentric, bizarre. Some said insane. He believed he had lived in previous lives as a Roman legionnaire, a Napoleonic cavalry officer, a Carthaginian warrior. He wrote poetry about battle. He carried ivory-handled revolvers. He cursed like a sailor and prayed like a saint. At West Point, Patton struggled academically. He suffered from dyslexia at a time when no one understood what dyslexia was. Teachers called him lazy. Classmates called him strange. He failed his first year and had to repeat it. But on the athletic field, he was a force. He competed in the 1912 Olympics in the modern pentathlon. He finished 5th out of 42 competitors against military officers from around the world. Then came World War I. Patton commanded the 1st American tank unit in combat. He was shot through the thigh, leading his men forward. He should have died. He didn't. Between the wars, while other officers played golf and climbed the social ladder, Patton obsessed over one subject: armored warfare. He read every German military text he could find. He studied Napoleon. He studied Stonewall Jackson. He studied Genghis Khan. While the rest of the American military slept through the 1930s, Patton was preparing for a war he knew was coming. Then Kasserine happened, and everything changed. On March 6, 1943, Patton took command of the shattered 2nd Corps. He walked into a unit that had lost its will to fight. What he did next was considered insane by every military standard of the time. Patton threw out the entire American military rulebook. He implemented an idea so radical, so brutal, so absolutely forbidden by conventional Allied doctrine that senior generals tried to have him removed. His idea: fight the Germans the way Germans fight. Move faster than they can think. Attack before they can defend. Strike gaps, not strongholds. Never stop. Never pause. Never consolidate. Push armor deep into enemy rear areas without waiting for infantry. Accept open flanks. Ignore supply chain limitations. Create chaos behind enemy lines so total that the entire German command structure would collapse from the inside out. American doctrine called this approach suicidal. Textbook warfare demanded careful advances, secured flanks, protected supply lines, methodical preparation. Patton's method violated every principle taught at West Point. British commanders like Montgomery considered him reckless, dangerous, unprofessional. Eisenhower warned him repeatedly. The War Department threatened to relieve him, but Patton had seen something nobody else had seen. He understood that the German blitzkrieg wasn't about tanks or planes or radios. It was about tempo. Speed so overwhelming that the enemy's decision-making process collapsed before he could respond. Patton believed Americans, with their superior industrial output, superior logistics, superior air power, could execute blitzkrieg better than the Germans ever had. All they needed was a commander willing to take the risk. They didn't know this single decision would save thousands of American lives and end the war in Europe nearly a year earlier than predicted. The test came in Sicily, July 1943. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Italian soil. Patton commanded the U.S. 7th Army. His mission, according to Allied planners, was secondary. Montgomery's British 8th Army would conduct the main advance up the eastern coast toward Messina. Patton was supposed to protect Montgomery's flank. Play second fiddle, stay out of the way. Patton had other plans. The moment he landed in Sicily, Patton did something that made Allied commanders go white with rage. He ignored his orders. He unleashed his forces in a lightning drive across the entire island. His armor moved with a speed that shocked both sides. In just 38 days, Patton's 7th Army covered more ground than any American army had covered since the Civil War. He raced across mountains. He crossed rivers without waiting for engineers. He pushed his men to exhaustion and beyond. German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding Axis forces in the Mediterranean, was stunned. His defensive planning collapsed completely. Every time his staff established a new defensive line, Patton was already past it. Every time Kesselring committed reserves to block an American advance, those reserves arrived to find empty terrain. The Americans had already moved on. On August 17, 1943, Patton's forces entered Messina, hours before Montgomery. The race was over. The Americans had won. Montgomery was furious. British generals demanded Patton's head, but the results were undeniable. The German defensive strategy for Sicily had been shattered. 167,000 Axis casualties. 132,000 prisoners taken. An entire Italian field army destroyed. German intelligence officers returning to Berlin began filing urgent reports. Something had changed. An American general had appeared who did not behave like other American generals. He moved faster. He struck harder. He took risks no Allied commander had taken before. His name started appearing in Wehrmacht field dispatches with increasing frequency. The Germans began to understand. They were no longer facing the soft, cautious Americans of Kasserine. They were facing something new, something dangerous, something they had no doctrine to defeat. But Sicily was just the beginning. Patton had only commanded an army for 38 days. He had barely scratched the surface of what his methods could achieve. In the months ahead, he would face a discipline problem that nearly ended his career. A famous slapping incident that got him removed from command. Months of humiliation watching other generals land in Normandy while he sat in England forgotten sidelined his career hanging by a thread. And yet somehow, impossibly, this disgraced general was about to return to the battlefield and unleash the most devastating armored campaign in American military history. A campaign so destructive that Hitler's personal staff would later admit the Wehrmacht had no weapon, no tactic, no general capable of stopping him. In Part 2, we'll witness the moment Patton's Third Army broke out of Normandy in August 1944. We'll see how his forces moved 400 miles in just 2 weeks, destroying 6 German divisions and capturing 30,000 prisoners in the process. We'll hear the secret German reports describing the absolute terror that spread through Wehrmacht headquarters when they realized who had returned to the battlefield. But more importantly, we'll expose the shocking truth German generals confessed after the war. The truth about why they considered Patton not Eisenhower, not Montgomery, not Bradley the single most dangerous Allied commander of the entire war. Because what the Germans said about Patton in their private reports wasn't just professional respect. It was fear. In Part 1, we met George S. Patton, Jr., the eccentric American general who shattered German defensive planning in Sicily with a radical philosophy of speed aggression and calculated recklessness. His Seventh Army raced across the island in just 38 days, reaching Messina, before Montgomery, and leaving 167,000 Axis casualties in his wake. German intelligence officers began filing urgent reports back to Berlin. Something had changed in the American military, but convincing the Allied High Command that Patton deserved a larger army that was about to become the biggest battle of his life. Because in the summer of 1943, Patton committed a single act of rage that nearly destroyed his career forever. An act so controversial that it would cost him command of the Normandy invasion. An act that would leave him humiliated, sidelined, and watching from England while other generals made history. And this is when everything got worse. August 3, 1943, a military hospital in Sicily. Patton was touring wounded soldiers, shaking hands, pinning medals. Then he entered a tent containing Private Charles H. Kuehl. Kuehl had no visible injuries. When Patton asked what was wrong with him, Kuehl replied he was suffering from battle fatigue, what we would now call PTSD. Patton exploded. He called Kuehl a coward, a disgrace to the uniform. He struck the young soldier across the face with his gloves. Then he kicked him out of the tent. A week later, on August 10th, Patton did it again, this time to Private Paul G. Bennett. He screamed at the sobbing soldier. He drew one of his ivory-handled revolvers and waved it in the boy's face. He slapped Bennett twice hard. The news reached General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Then it reached journalists. Then it reached Washington. The political storm was nuclear. Congressmen demanded Patton's court-martial. Newspapers ran front-page condemnations. The American public was outraged. Eisenhower faced the hardest decision of his career. He could fire Patton and satisfy public opinion, or he could save the one general who had proven he could fight the Germans on their own terms. Eisenhower refused to fire him, but the price was brutal. Patton was forced to apologize publicly to every soldier in his army. He was stripped of the Seventh Army. He was sent to England and placed on ice. For 11 agonizing months from August 1943 to July 1944, Patton had no command, no army, no troops, nothing but humiliation. Then came D-Day, June 6, 1944. 156,000 Allied soldiers stormed the Normandy beaches. 4,414 Allied soldiers died on the first day alone. Patton watched from England, seething, while Omar Bradley commanded the U.S. First Army, while Montgomery led the British forces, while younger, less experienced generals got the glory he believed belonged to him. But something unexpected was happening behind the scenes. Eisenhower had a secret plan. He had created Operation Fortitude, the most elaborate deception in military history, and Patton, the disgraced sideline general, was the centerpiece of that deception. Eisenhower understood something critical. He knew the Germans were terrified of Patton. German intelligence had been tracking him obsessively. Every German field marshal believed Patton would lead the main Allied invasion, so Eisenhower used Patton as bait. He assigned him to command a completely fake army called the 1st United States Army Group stationed at Dover, supposedly preparing to invade Pas-de-Calais. It worked brilliantly. Hitler and his generals kept 15 divisions, over 150,000 elite troops, waiting at Pas-de-Calais for Patton's phantom invasion. Those divisions never moved to Normandy. Those divisions could have destroyed the Allied beachhead if they had. Patton's reputation alone had won the Battle of Normandy before he even entered combat. But this unexpected ally, this secret success gave Patton exactly what he needed: leverage. By late July 1944, the Allies were stuck in Normandy. 6 weeks of brutal hedgerow fighting. 122,000 American casualties. Only 30 miles of advance. Bradley and Eisenhower knew they needed someone to break the deadlock. They needed speed. They needed aggression. They needed a man willing to take insane risks. They needed Patton. On August 1, 1944, Patton officially took command of the newly activated U.S. Third Army. Eisenhower gave him one mission: break out of Normandy and destroy the German army in France. But there were conditions. Patton had one chance. If he failed, if his forces stretched too thin, if he lost control of his columns, Eisenhower would relieve him permanently. No second chances, no third acts. Patton accepted. He had been preparing for this moment his entire life. The test came on August 1, 1944. The French countryside. Weather clearing after weeks of rain. American bomber crews, Army group commanders, and skeptical British liaison officers watched as Patton's Third Army moved out. German Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge had established what he believed was an impenetrable defensive line. He had 100,000 troops, hundreds of tanks, and interior lines of communication. Patton smashed through it in 72 hours. His armored columns didn't stop. They didn't consolidate. They didn't wait for infantry support. 4 divisions of the Third Army poured through a gap barely 10 miles wide, and then fanned out across France like water breaking a dam. General John Shirley Wood's 4th Armored Division advanced 40 miles in a single day, then 50, then 60. German communications collapsed. Division headquarters were overrun before they knew Americans were in the sector. At Avranches, the critical road junction everyone expected Patton to secure, he simply passed through it without stopping. His columns split into multiple thrusts. One raced west into Brittany. One drove south toward the Loire. One pushed east toward Paris. One threatened to encircle the entire German 7th Army. Kluge was paralyzed. He called Hitler's headquarters in desperation. Where was the main American effort? Which axis should he defend? Hitler ordered a massive counterattack at Mortain. 4 panzer divisions, elite SS formations. They were supposed to cut off Patton's advance and restore the front. The counterattack was a disaster. Patton saw it coming. He kept pushing east while the Germans attacked west. Allied fighter bombers massacred the exposed panzer columns. Within 72 hours, the German counterattack collapsed with 40 tanks destroyed and 5,000 casualties. Then came the moment nobody expected. By August 12th, Patton's forces had raced so far east that they were threatening to cut off and encircle the entire German Army Group B from behind. What had started as a breakout had become a catastrophe for the Wehrmacht. An entire German field army, 100,000 troops, 1,300 tanks, was trapped in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. The numbers were staggering. In just 14 days of combat, Patton's Third Army advanced 400 miles across France. His forces destroyed 6 German divisions completely. They captured 30,000 prisoners. They killed or wounded another 20,000 enemy soldiers. They liberated 47,000 square miles of French territory. Paris fell on August 25th, far ahead of Allied schedule. German observers were shattered by what they had witnessed. Field Marshal Walter Model Hitler's fireman, the genius who had plugged impossible gaps on the Eastern Front, arrived in France on August 17th to stabilize the situation. He sent a private message back to Berlin. The message was devastating in its honesty. The German defensive system in France had collapsed, not because of superior American numbers, not because of Allied air power alone, but because of one American general whose operational tempo had destroyed the German capacity to respond coherently. But success in Normandy was one thing. Sustaining it was another entirely. Eisenhower faced an impossible decision. Patton wanted to keep driving east, all the way to the Rhine, maybe into Germany itself. He believed correctly that the Wehrmacht in the West was on the verge of total collapse. If given enough fuel, enough ammunition, enough political support, he could end the war by Christmas, 1944. But Montgomery wanted the supplies. The British general had his own plan. Operation Market Garden, a massive airborne assault in Holland. Eisenhower chose Montgomery. On September 4, 1944, Patton's tanks ran out of gas near the German border. Forced to halt. Forced to wait. Forced to watch as the Germans rebuilt their defenses. Patton was furious. In his diary, he wrote words that still haunt military historians. "I could go through the Siegfried Line, if only they would let me move my command." But the move wasn't coming. The fuel wasn't coming. The chance to end the war quickly was slipping away. By October 1944, the Germans had regrouped. They had fortified the West Wall. They had reinforced their positions with fresh divisions from the Eastern Front. Patton's offensive momentum, the single most powerful Allied weapon in the Western theater, had been squandered by inter-Allied politics. And as Patton sat frustrated at his command post in Lorraine, something terrible was brewing in the Ardennes forest. Hitler was planning his final desperate gamble. A massive counteroffensive that would smash through thinly defended American lines and race for the port of Antwerp. An attack that would catch American forces completely by surprise. An attack that would create the largest and bloodiest single battle in American military history. From a disgraced general slapping soldiers in a hospital tent to the commander whose name alone diverted 15 German divisions. From a sidelined officer watching D-Day from England to the conqueror who liberated 47,000 square miles of France in 14 days. Patton had transformed himself from an Allied liability into the single most feared American commander of the war. Even German field marshals who had once dismissed American fighting ability now filed reports describing Third Army operations as impossible to counter. But as winter closed in on the Western Front, as fuel shortages halted the Allied advance, as Eisenhower diverted resources to Montgomery's failed Market Garden operation, Hitler was preparing his most audacious gamble of the entire war. 200,000 German troops, 1,000 tanks, complete radio silence, complete operational surprise. On December 16, 1944, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the Germans would unleash a counterattack so unexpected, so devastating, that it would threaten to split the Allied armies in half and push them back into the English Channel. And in Part 3, we'll witness the most remarkable feat of military command in American history. We'll see how Patton, with just 48 hours of warning, turned his entire army 90 degrees north in the middle of a blizzard and raced 100 miles through ice, snow, and frozen roads to rescue 18,000 trapped American paratroopers at Bastogne. We'll hear the shocking private confessions of German generals who watched in horror as Patton accomplished what they considered militarily impossible. Because what happened next didn't just save the American army. It changed the course of World War II forever. In parts 1 and 2, we watched George S. Patton transform from a disgraced general into the most feared Allied commander in Europe. His lightning breakout from Normandy destroyed 6 German divisions in 14 days. His Third Army advanced 400 miles across France. German Field Marshal Walter Model privately admitted the Wehrmacht had no defensive doctrine capable of stopping him. But when the tin spread through German headquarters, something unexpected happened. Hitler himself took personal control of the Western Front. He gathered 200,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, and 1,900 artillery pieces in absolute secrecy. He planned the largest surprise attack of the entire war in the West. Radio silence was absolute. Intelligence leaks were punishable by death. Not even senior field commanders knew the full scope until 48 hours before 0 hour. And this was no longer an experiment. This was total war on a scale that would dwarf anything Patton had yet faced. December 16, 1944. 5:30 a.m. The Ardennes forest. Frozen. Silent. Covered in thick fog. American soldiers of the 106th Infantry Division were drinking coffee when the sky exploded. 1,900 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes. Then came the panzers. SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, Panzer Lehr. The 1st SS Panzer Corps. Elite formations Hitler had personally selected. The thinly defended American line shattered. Within 24 hours, German spearheads had advanced 20 miles into Allied territory. By December 19th, they had penetrated 50 miles. Entire American regiments were surrounded. The 7,000 men of the 106th Division surrendered, one of the largest mass surrenders in American military history. Panic swept through Allied headquarters. Eisenhower faced catastrophe. The German commander leading the southern pincer was General Hasso von Manteuffel. He had studied Patton obsessively for months. He knew Third Army was positioned far to the south, facing the Saar region. His own intelligence staff had calculated that even under perfect conditions, Patton would need at least 2 weeks to reorient his forces northward. 2 weeks that would be more than enough time for Manteuffel's panzers to reach the Meuse River, split the Allied armies, and force Eisenhower to negotiate. German field reports described the mood at Army Group B headquarters as electric. Confident, even triumphant. Model told his staff that if the Americans responded according to standard doctrine, the offensive would succeed. Everything depended on the Americans behaving predictably. Everything depended on Patton being as slow as other Allied commanders. But the Germans had made a fatal miscalculation. Patton had anticipated this attack. Weeks before the Ardennes offensive, his intelligence officer, Colonel Oskar Koch, had warned him that German reserves were massing opposite the Ardennes sector. Patton believed him. While other Allied generals dismissed the warnings, Patton quietly ordered his staff to prepare a contingency plan. 3 separate operational plans. 3 different axes of advance, 3 ways to turn Third Army 90 degrees north on short notice. When Eisenhower called an emergency meeting at Verdun on December 19, 1944, the situation appeared hopeless. Bradley was stunned. Montgomery was cautious. Eisenhower turned to Patton and asked the impossible question. How soon could Third Army counterattack the southern flank of the German salient? Patton's answer electrified the room. 48 hours, 3 divisions, ready to attack. The general stared at him in disbelief. What Patton was proposing violated every principle of military logistics. Turning an entire army of 250,000 men, 1,500 tanks, and thousands of supply vehicles 90 degrees in the middle of a winter blizzard across frozen roads, while simultaneously disengaging from combat with German forces to the east. It was considered militarily impossible. But this is not where the obstacles ended. The scale of the crisis became clearer by the hour. In the town of Bastogne, a critical road junction, 18,000 American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division were completely surrounded. 7 roads converged at Bastogne. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the entire German offensive corridor. If Bastogne fell, the entire Ardennes would fall with it. German commanders demanded immediate surrender. On December 22, General Heinrich von Luttwitz sent a formal ultimatum to the American defenders. The American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, responded with a single word that became legendary: nuts. But bravado wouldn't save them. The paratroopers had no winter clothing. Their artillery was running out of ammunition at a rate of 10 rounds per gun per day. Their wounded were dying from the cold at a rate of 50 per day. Medical supplies were exhausted. The Luftwaffe, regaining confidence, flew 800 sorties over the pocket. American casualties inside Bastogne climbed past 2,000 by December 23. Meanwhile, Patton faced his own nightmare. His army had to execute the most complex maneuver in American military history. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow fell continuously. Roads turned into sheets of ice. 133,000 vehicles had to be redirected. Fuel trucks skidded off cliffs. Tank transmissions froze solid. Men died from exposure faster than from enemy action. The American Third Corps was tasked with the northern attack. 3 divisions: the 4th Armored, the 26th Infantry, the 88th Infantry. Most of these soldiers had been in continuous combat for months. They were exhausted. Some units had less than 50% of their authorized strength. Supply depots were 100 miles from the new attack axis. Critics whispered that Patton had finally overreached. Some at Bradley's headquarters quietly predicted catastrophic failure. If the counterattack stalled, if Bastogne fell, if the 101st Airborne was destroyed, the blame would fall squarely on Patton's shoulders. His career would end in disgrace. The war might be prolonged by 6 more months. Tens of thousands of additional Allied lives would be lost. But then an event changed everything. December 22, 1944. 6 a.m. Third Army's counteroffensive began in total darkness. The 4th Armored Division under Major General Hugh Gaffey led the northern thrust. Their mission was brutal: advance 25 miles through German-held territory, break the siege of Bastogne, relieve the 101st Airborne, all while fighting elite panzer units in blizzard conditions. The first day was a nightmare. American tanks advanced into waist-deep snow. Visibility dropped to 50 feet. German anti-tank guns, hidden behind hedgerows, ambushed American columns. The 4th Armored lost 15 Sherman tanks in the first 6 hours. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Patton raged. He drove to the front personally. He walked through the snow in his famous leather coat, ivory revolvers at his hips, cursing at his division commanders. He fired officers who moved too slowly. He reorganized supply priorities. He diverted 6,000 tons of ammunition and fuel directly to the spearhead units within 48 hours. December 23, 1944. The skies cleared for the first time in a week. 2,000 Allied fighter bombers appeared over the Ardennes. C-47 transports dropped 144 tons of supplies into Bastogne, relieving the immediate ammunition crisis. German columns caught in the open were massacred from the air. 88 German tanks destroyed in a single day. Over 300 German vehicles burned on the roads. On the ground, Patton's forces accelerated. The 4th Armored pushed forward through the village of Chaumont, then Bernin, then Hompré. German resistance was fierce but disorganized. The Panzer Lehr Division, once Monteufel's pride, lost 60% of its armor in 72 hours of combat. December 26, 1944. 4:45 p.m. The moment of decision. Lieutenant Charles Bogus, of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, spotted American paratroopers waving from the edge of the Bastogne perimeter. His tank crashed through the German encirclement at Assenois. Within minutes, a corridor opened between Third Army and the besieged town. The siege of Bastogne was broken. 18,000 American paratroopers were saved. The numbers were devastating for the Germans. In just 4 days of combat, Patton's Third Army had advanced through impossible terrain against elite German formations. His forces killed or wounded 12,000 German soldiers. They destroyed or captured 81 German tanks. They shattered the entire southern flank of Hitler's great offensive. Manteuffel himself later admitted the shock. He wrote in private correspondence that the speed of Patton's response had been militarily inconceivable. He had expected 2 weeks. Patton had done it in 5 days. The entire strategic foundation of the Ardennes offensive had collapsed because one American general had moved faster than the Wehrmacht believed possible. Inside Bastogne, American paratroopers wept openly when Third Army tanks arrived. An anonymous sergeant of the 101st Airborne was quoted in newspaper reports. He said simply that he had never been so happy to see another American unit in his entire life. The ammunition these paratroopers received in the first 24 hours after relief exceeded what they had received in the entire previous week. The news of this victory spread fast. News of Bastogne's relief electrified the Allied world. Newspapers across America ran banner headlines. Radio broadcasts interrupted regular programming. Winston Churchill personally congratulated Patton. Franklin D. Roosevelt sent a private telegram praising the operation as one of the most brilliant maneuvers in American military history. Inside the German command, the mood was catastrophic. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander of the Western Front, sent a private assessment to Hitler. He described the Ardennes offensive as finished. He recommended immediate withdrawal to the original German defensive lines. Hitler refused. The consequences were devastating. By January 28, 1945, when the Battle of the Bulge officially ended, German losses were staggering. 100,000 killed, wounded, or captured. 800 tanks destroyed. 1,000 aircraft lost. Combined Allied losses, though heavy, at 81,000 casualties, were sustainable. German losses were not. The Wehrmacht would never again mount a major offensive in the West. The strategic impact extended far beyond the battlefield. Hitler had gambled his last strategic reserve on the Ardennes offensive. That reserve was gone. Panzer divisions that could have stopped the Soviet advance into Germany were destroyed in the Ardennes. The Eastern Front began to collapse in February 1945. Berlin would fall in less than 100 days. For Patton personally, the Bastogne relief became the defining moment of his career. Eisenhower nominated him for the Distinguished Service Cross. British field marshals who had criticized him publicly apologized privately. Captured German officers repeatedly asked American interrogators the same question. How had Third Army moved so fast? The numbers explained the answer. Compared to standard Allied advance rates, Third Army had moved 300% faster during the Bastogne operation. Their fuel consumption had exceeded projections by 250%. Their logistical improvisation had redirected 62,000 tons of supplies in 72 hours, a feat no Allied army had ever accomplished. German field reports captured in the final weeks of the war contained admissions that professional German officers would normally never make in writing. Patton's operational methods, they conceded, had rendered conventional German defensive doctrine obsolete. The Wehrmacht, which had invented blitzkrieg in 1939, had been defeated in 1944 by an American who understood blitzkrieg better than its own creators. From a disgraced general slapping soldiers in a Sicilian hospital tent, Patton had become the man who broke Hitler's final offensive. From a sidelined commander watching D-Day from England, he had become the author of the largest and most decisive counterattack in American military history. From an eccentric outcast considered too dangerous to lead, he had become the single most effective Allied field commander of the entire European war. But what happened to the man himself? What became of George S. Patton, Jr. after his greatest victory? How did the war end for the general the Germans feared most? And why, just months after his triumph at Bastogne, did Patton's own government begin treating him as a liability? A problem to be managed. A voice that needed to be silenced. In Part 4, we will uncover the final chapter of the Patton story. A chapter most history books refuse to discuss honestly. The mysterious car accident in December 1945. The classified investigations that followed. The private warnings Patton made in the final months of his life about the next great war he believed was coming. The accusations. The conspiracy theories. The shocking truths that emerged decades later from declassified OSS files. Because the story of George S. Patton did not end with victory. It ended with a mystery that historians are still trying to solve. In parts 1, 2, and 3, we followed George S. Patton's extraordinary journey. From a disgraced general who slapped soldiers in a Sicilian hospital tent to the architect of the most devastating armored breakout in American military history. From the phantom commander of a fake army to the real commander who relieved Bastogne in 5 days when German generals believed it would take 2 weeks. His Third Army killed or captured over 550,000 enemy soldiers, destroyed 1,500 German tanks, and liberated 81,522 square miles of European territory. But what happened to the man behind the legend? Because the story of George S. Patton has a final chapter that most history books refuse to discuss honestly. A chapter full of mystery classified documents, and a death so strange that serious historians are still debating what actually happened. Declassified OSS files released decades later would reveal warnings Patton made in his final months that his own government tried desperately to silence. Because success, it turns out, sometimes comes with a price that cannot be paid in medals. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Germany surrenders unconditionally. Patton's Third Army had punched through the Siegfried Line, crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim, and raced deep into Czechoslovakia and Austria. His forces had liberated over 12 concentration camps, including Buchenwald and Gusen. They had captured more German soldiers in the final weeks than any other Allied army. 1.2 million prisoners of war passed through Third Army's hands. The celebrations in American newspapers were enormous. Patton was hailed as the liberator of Europe, general of the army, potential future president. His face appeared on the cover of Life magazine. Parades were planned in Boston, Los Angeles, and Washington. Political figures hinted at a Senate run. Hollywood studios bid for the rights to his story. But Patton did not want parades. He wanted a new command. He wanted to fight the Japanese in the Pacific. Douglas MacArthur quietly vetoed the idea. MacArthur had no intention of sharing the spotlight with the most famous general in America. Patton was redirected to occupation duty in Bavaria as military governor. This is where his troubles began. Patton openly criticized Allied denazification policies. He believed the systematic removal of all former Nazi Party members from government positions was creating chaos in post-war Germany. He kept experienced German administrators in their posts to maintain order. American newspapers called him pro-Nazi. Eisenhower received political pressure from Washington. On October 2, 1945, Patton was formally relieved of command of Third Army. Then came the warnings that made him dangerous. In private correspondence to his wife Beatrice and close friends, Patton began writing about the Soviet Union. He warned that Stalin was preparing for a larger war. He advocated rearming German units to fight alongside American forces against the Red Army. He predicted a Soviet military push to the Atlantic within a decade. He called Russia the new enemy in a series of letters that would later be examined by historians for decades. The Truman administration considered these views politically catastrophic. The United States was still officially allied with the Soviet Union. Publishing such statements could have destabilized the fragile post-war order. December 9, 1945. A cold Sunday morning in Germany. Patton was traveling to a hunting trip in a 1938 Cadillac Model 75 staff car. An army truck made an unexpected left turn at low speed. The collision was minor. Every other passenger walked away with bruises. Patton struck his head against a glass partition and broke his neck at the C3 and C4 vertebrae. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He lingered for 12 days in a Heidelberg hospital. On December 21, 1945, at the age of 60, George S. Patton died of a pulmonary embolism. The man who had survived 2 world wars, 3 tank battles, and hundreds of combat missions died in an auto accident that killed no one else and left no other serious injuries. His last words, spoken to his wife, were simple and haunting. It's too dark. Too late. But his legacy was only beginning. The operational methods Patton pioneered did not die with him. They became the foundation of modern American armored warfare. His emphasis on speed-deep exploitation and decentralized command influenced every major American military doctrine that followed. In Korea, 1950, General Matthew Ridgway used Patton's aggressive counterattack philosophy to stabilize the collapsing UN front after the Chinese intervention. Ridgway had served under Patton's philosophy. His Operation Killer and Operation Ripper relied on exactly the sustained pressure and forward momentum that Patton had championed. Casualty ratios favored American forces 10-1 in the subsequent offensives. In Vietnam, armored cavalry units operated with the same initiative and flexibility Patton had demanded of his Third Army commanders. The 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, known as the Black Horse Regiment, executed combat operations that veterans openly described as Patton-style warfare in the Cambodian incursion of 1970. But the most dramatic validation came in 1991. Operation Desert Storm, the 100-hour ground war against Iraq. General H. Norman Schwarzkopf's left hook maneuver, which encircled Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard, was directly modeled on Patton's Sicily campaign and his sweep through France in 1944. General Fred Franks, Jr., commanding 7th Corps, carried a copy of Patton's memoirs with him throughout the campaign. American armor advanced 300 miles in 100 hours. Iraqi losses reached 3,847 tanks destroyed. American losses, 28 tanks total. A kill ratio that exceeded even Patton's best operational results. Foreign militaries studied Patton intensely. The Israeli Defense Forces built their entire armored doctrine around his principles. Israeli General Ariel Sharon's 1973 Yom Kippur War counterattack across the Suez Canal was explicitly modeled on Third Army operations. Soviet military academies ironically taught Patton's methods to Red Army officers throughout the Cold War. The Russian military even today studies his Ardennes counterattack as a textbook case of operational reorientation. The numbers tell an incredible story. Over the past 80 years, more than 47 countries have incorporated Patton's operational principles into their official military doctrine. American tank doctrine manuals from 1946 to 2024 all reference his techniques by name. The M1 Abrams main battle tank. America's primary armored weapon system was designed specifically to execute the deep penetration operations Patton pioneered. But the greatest lesson was not about tanks. The deeper lesson of Patton's career speaks to something fundamental about institutions, innovation, and courage. Patton was never a comfortable fit within the American military establishment. His eccentricities annoyed his superiors. His aggressive methods violated doctrine. His political opinions created scandals. The system repeatedly tried to discard him. It promoted safer, more conventional officers over him at multiple points in his career. Yet when real crisis came, when armies collapsed and conventional approaches failed, the system turned desperately to the man it had tried to remove. Kasserine Pass created Patton. The Normandy deadlock required Patton. The Ardennes catastrophe could only be solved by Patton. Every time the establishment believed it could succeed without him, reality proved otherwise. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Admiral Horatio Nelson at Trafalgar, General Thomas Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto at Pearl Harbor. These commanders succeeded precisely because they broke rules that their institutions considered sacred. The system could neither predict them nor properly reward them. But when wars needed winning, the system had no choice but to use them. In business, the same pattern appears. Steve Jobs was fired from Apple before he returned to transform it. Colonel Sanders failed 1,009 times before Kentucky Fried Chicken succeeded. Walt Disney was fired from a newspaper for lacking imagination. Innovation, it seems, requires someone willing to be wrong publicly repeatedly and for a long time before finally being proven right. Patton understood this instinctively. In his private diary, he wrote a passage that has become one of the most famous military quotations of the 20th century. He wrote that success in war requires only two things: the willingness to die and the ability to remain decisive in the face of chaos. Every officer could be taught tactics. Very few could be taught courage. And there is one final detail that most people never hear about. In 2008, a former OSS contractor named Douglas Bazada gave a series of deathbed interviews that rocked the historical community. Bazada claimed that Patton's death had not been an accident. He alleged that he had been ordered by the head of OSS William Donovan himself to stage the car accident. The motive: to silence Patton's increasingly dangerous public warnings about the Soviet Union. Bazada's claims were never officially confirmed. The FBI and CIA denied all involvement. The Army's official accident investigation, declassified in full in 2002, concluded the crash was genuinely accidental. But the strange circumstances, the minor impact that somehow killed only Patton, the missing accident report pages. The sudden transfer of Patton's driver, Horace Woodring, away from Europe. Within weeks, the disappearance of the truck driver Robert Thompson from military records entirely have kept the theory alive for over 80 years. Was it an accident? Was it an assassination? Historians remain deeply divided. What is undeniable is that Patton's warnings about the Soviet Union proved precisely correct. Within 3 years of his death, the Berlin blockade began. Within 5 years, the Korean War erupted. Within 8 years, the Cold War had divided Europe exactly along the lines Patton had predicted. The man died. His predictions survived. His death, from a dyslexic cavalry officer laughed at during his years at West Point, to the American general that Nazi field marshals admitted they could not defeat George S. Patton, transformed warfare forever. His methods saved approximately 500,000 Allied lives by shortening the European war by an estimated 6 to 9 months. His influence shaped military doctrine in 47 countries over 8 decades. His fingerprints remain on every modern armored campaign from Desert Storm to Ukraine. But his real gift was not in tanks or tactics. It was in proving that history does not belong to the comfortable, the conventional, or the politically careful. History belongs to those willing to be called reckless, difficult, and insane. Those willing to move when others pause. Those willing to bet their careers, their reputations, and their lives on an idea the system has rejected. Patton was laughed at, sidelined, nearly fired. Scandal followed him from Sicily to the Rhine. Yet when Europe needed saving, when entire Allied armies were paralyzed, when German panzers threatened to split the continent in half, it was the eccentric outcast, the man in the leather coat with ivory revolvers, who broke Hitler's offensive and drove the Wehrmacht to its knees. If you enjoyed this story, if you felt the weight of what one determined man can accomplish when he refuses to surrender his convictions, please hit that like button. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of the Second World War. Share this video with anyone who believes courage still matters in a world that rewards caution. Because the lesson of George S. Patton endures beyond tanks and trenches. It reminds us that the people who change history are rarely the people who follow the rules. They are the ones brave enough to break the rules for the right reasons at the right moment, when everything is on the line. As Patton himself once said in words that have echoed across 80 years of military history, "Wars are fought with weapons, but they are won by men. It is the spirit of the men who follow and the man who leads that gains victory." And the spirit of George S. Patton still leads today.